In the summer of 2023, a British missile quietly entered the Ukraine war, and Russia didn't realize how much trouble it was in until it was too late. Storm Shadow, the UK's long-range, low-flying cruise missile that weighs barely 1,300 kilograms, suddenly had the power to reshape Russia's entire southern theater. And by 2024, Storm Shadow and its French twin, Scalp EG, were doing more than destroying ships and bridges. They were tearing at the spine of Russia's logistics. By 2025, Britain and France went further and lifted restrictions, letting Ukraine hit military targets inside Russia. And suddenly, Russian industrial plants, air bases, fuel depots, and command centers deep behind the border were no longer beyond reach. Storm Shadow didn't win the war. It did something more dangerous for Russia. It gave Ukraine strategic reach and political leverage it never had before. So this is the story of how one missile, designed in the 1990s, ignored by many analysts, and underestimated by nearly everyone, forced Russia to rethink an entire war. Ukraine had fired thousands of artillery shells, launched swarms of drones, and deployed every Western system it had been given. But nothing shook Russia the way one British missile did in May 2023. Britain announced the delivery in a single, restrained statement, calling it a proportionate response. But inside the Kremlin, that phrase set off a wave of confusion. Proportionate to what? The missile's range? Its punch? Or the fear it would generate? Most analysts said that it was just another cruise missile. Useful, but not decisive. They were thinking like the last war, not the one unfolding. They didn't understand what Ukraine was about to do with it. Storm Shadow was nothing like what Ukraine had used before. It wasn't HIMARS whose range was too short. It wasn't a drone which Russia could jam or shoot down. And it wasn't ATACMS, which the US dripped out with restrictions tighter than a lockbox. Storm Shadow was different. It flew low, it flew quiet, and it flew with a brain, a guidance soid built to think its way past air defenses. When Ukraine launched its first salvo, Russian radar operators didn't even know what they were tracking. The missiles hugged terrain, slipped under radars, curved around known air defense corridors, and appeared over targets that Russia believed were safe simply because they were far away. Then the blast came. Deep in occupied territory but far from the front, explosions ripped through command posts and ammunition hubs. Russian commanders assumed it was sabotage, but they were wrong. It was the British missile they had dismissed as unlikely to change much, and that's when Moscow realized this wasn't another HIMARS moment. This was a range they couldn't predict and a penetration capability they couldn't block. And the real shock wasn't what Storm Shadow destroyed. It was what it made possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive, please like the video and consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more global insights. Now, back to the video. For 2 years, Russia believed one simple truth. If something was far enough behind the front line, Ukraine couldn't touch it. Storm Shadow erased that belief in a single week, with a range stretching from 250 to nearly 500 kilometers depending on launch profile. Storm Shadow didn't just extend Ukraine's reach, it multiplied it. Targets once considered deep rear suddenly became within an hour's flight. Command centers in Crimea, naval bases in Sevastopol, ammunition depots hidden behind layers of occupied territory. Even airfields Russia thought were safely tucked away. Distance stopped being protection. It became a liability. But range alone didn't make Russia nervous. It was how Storm Shadow traveled that broke their confidence. The missile doesn't fly like a rocket. It crawls through the air like a shadow. Its stealth design gives it an invisibly small radar signature, too small for many Russian radars to detect at long distance. And its terrain-hugging profile lets it skim just above the ground, weaving between hills, valleys, and coastlines. Russian operators often spot it only in the last seconds, usually too late to intercept. Then there's the warhead. Storm Shadow's BROACH tandem warhead isn't designed to damage a target, it's designed to ruin it. The first charge punches a hole. The second charge, the main warhead, detonates inside the structure. Command bunkers, reinforced hangars, hardened HQs, they all become metal confetti. It's a warhead built specifically to kill what Russia hides, not what it shows. But the most terrifying part for Moscow isn't the stealth, the range, or the warhead. It's the brain. Storm Shadow uses multiple guidance systems at once: inertial navigation, GPS, terrain reference, and an infrared seeker that identifies the target by its heat and shape. Even if Russia jams the GPS, Storm Shadow doesn't wander. It remembers the terrain. It recognizes the structure. It hits anyway. and this puts Russian air defense into an impossible position. If they point their radars up, Storm Shadow flies low. If they point them down, Storm Shadow appears from another direction. If they jam it, it switches to another mode. If they shoot at it, they often detect it too late. Russia's vast S-300 and S-400 belts were built to stop aircraft. They were never built to stop a missile that thinks for itself. And once Ukraine had this reach, the first target had to be the one Moscow thought was inviolable. For years, Sevastopol was the one place Russia believed was untouchable, the fortress city, the pride of the Black Sea Fleet, a naval headquarters so deep behind the lines that Moscow treated it like a capital, not a target. On the 22nd of September 2023, that illusion died. Ukraine had been preparing the strike for weeks, mapping air defense corridors, analyzing radar gaps, timing coastal patrols, and feeding Russia false patterns with drone swarms. Every move was a misdirection. Every flight path was a rehearsal for one moment, the Storm Shadow breakthrough. And then came the detail that made the attack devastating: the timing. Ukrainian intelligence learned that Russia's naval leadership would be meeting inside the Black Sea Fleet headquarters that morning. Senior leadership, the kind of decision-makers who don't gather unless they believe the walls around them are secure. They believed the building was safe. They believed Sevastopol was untouchable. They believed range and geography were on their side. Storm Shadow did not care. The missiles entered Crimean airspace at low altitude, hugging the coastline so closely that some Russian radars never saw them at all. By the time they appeared on screens, alarms were already sounding too late. Seconds later, the headquarters erupted. The explosion wasn't just a breach, it was a cavity torn through reinforced stone, steel, and concrete. Fires raged through command rooms. Videos showed part of the roof collapsing. Satellite imagery confirmed a massive internal detonation. Then came the rumors Moscow couldn't bury. Ukrainian officials claimed that 34 Russian officers were killed, including Admiral Viktor Sokolov. Russia denied it, then avoided the subject, then released footage so obviously staged it fueled more speculation. The truth? Still murky. But one fact was undeniable. The Black Sea Fleet lost its command center in broad daylight during a leadership meeting. Operational chaos followed immediately. Communications were disrupted, coordination broke down, fleet units began scattering to auxiliary ports. Russian ships started moving from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Command functions were split, relocated, and in some cases improvised. Within hours, Sevastopol went from a fortress to a liability. The psychological damage was even larger. Russia's officers realized they were not safe. Not in bunkers, not in headquarters, not even in Crimea. A British missile had reached the heart of their naval power and leveled it without warning, and that was only the beginning, because Storm Shadow wasn't finished with the Black Sea Fleet, not even close. The Black Sea Fleet liked to call itself the gatekeeper of the region, the force that secured Crimea, controlled sea lanes, and intimidated NATO's eastern flank. For the first year of the war, that arrogance held. Russia acted as though its ships were invulnerable simply because they were docked behind thick layers of S-300s and S-400s. But the first major blow came when Ukraine struck the Minsk, a Rapucha-class landing ship Russia considered essential for troop movements and logistics. Moscow believed the vessel was safe inside a fortified port, but it wasn't. Storm Shadow bypassed the defensive rings and slammed into the ship's hull, igniting ammunition, fuel, and deck equipment in a chain of explosions. By morning, Minsk wasn't a ship. It was a carcass. But the real shock came next. Ukraine targeted Rostov-on-Don, a Kilo-class submarine that Russia relied on to launch Caliber cruise missiles across Ukraine. Hitting a docked submarine protected by multiple layers of air defense was considered impossible by most analysts, even Western ones. Storm Shadow made it look easy. The missile tore into the submarine while it was undergoing repairs, triggering fires that engulfed the dry dock and caused catastrophic internal damage. Footage showed flames pouring from its hull. Russia later tried to claim it would be repaired, but satellite images told the truth. The vessel was effectively finished. Then, in December 2023, Ukraine delivered the strike that finally forced the Black Sea Fleet into full retreat. Storm Shadow missiles hit the port of Feodosia and incinerated the landing ship Novocherkassk in a detonation so violent that local windows shattered for kilometers. Seen from orbit, the ship was reduced to a blackened, skeletal wreck, burned down to the waterline. This wasn't harassment, this was a systematic dismantling of Russia's naval presence in Crimea. After these losses, Russian admirals faced a decision they never expected to make. Stay in Sevastopol and lose more ships, or flee. They chose to flee. One by one, Russian vessels withdrew to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland, a port farther from Ukraine, less efficient for operations and increasingly crowded with ships that were never meant to be based there long-term. Logistics became harder, turnaround times slowed, patrol reach shrank. The Black Sea Fleet went from projecting power to avoiding destruction. Strategically, the impact was enormous. Every ship destroyed meant fewer missile launches into Ukraine. Every relocation meant weaker control over Crimea. Every strike forced Russia to redistribute its air defenses, weakening the front lines. And every flaming wreck sent the same message. Crimea was no longer a sanctuary. Storm Shadow didn't just sink ships, it sank Russia's belief that distance equals safety. And once the ships were burning, Ukraine turned its fire to the arteries of occupation. For months, Moscow had treated Crimea like an unbreakable fortress, a peninsula fed by bridges, railways, fuel depots, and repair hubs that kept its southern forces moving. Storm Shadow changed that overnight. The Chonhar Bridge was the first artery to bleed. This was Russia's main highway link from mainland Ukraine into northern Crimea, a route Moscow believed was too far, too defended, and too essential for Ukraine to ever meaningfully threaten. Storm Shadow proved them wrong. Its precision and BROACH bunker-breaking warhead didn't just damage the bridge, it carved through the roadway and support structure with surgical violence. And when Russia rushed to patch it, Storm Shadow hit it again. Now and again. Each strike slowed repairs, delayed rotations, and forced Russia to reroute supplies through less efficient, longer paths. Soon, Ukraine expanded the pressure. Fuel depots vanished in fireballs. Ammunition warehouses erupted across the peninsula. Rail junctions that once moved thousands of tons per day suddenly became inoperable craters. Repair facilities, the quiet, invisible backbone of any war effort, burned with the same intensity as frontline positions. And the effect? Russia's logistics bent until they creaked. Convoys had to travel further from the safety of the Kerch route. Fuel shortages became routine. Munition flows slowed at the exact moment Ukraine's counteroffensive demanded speed and flexibility. Crimea, once Russia's most secure staging area, became a liability. Storm Shadow had turned geography itself into a weapon. But Moscow wasn't going to let this continue without adaptation, and adaptation came fast. For the first time since the war began, Russia faced a weapon it couldn't easily predict or intercept. So the countermeasures began. The first step, pull apart the missile. Whenever Storm Shadow fragments were recovered, Russian technicians rushed them to labs. They studied the multi-layered guidance package, inertial navigation blended with terrain mapping, imaging infrared, and GPS correction. They examined the stealthy shaping, the composite skin, and the BROACH warhead's dual-stage design. The aim was simple: find a weakness, any weakness. But even understanding the missile didn't mean stopping it. Next came the air defense shuffle. Russia began reinforcing the Bryansk-Kursk-Belgorod belt, creating a thicker barrier around key approach routes. S-300s and S-400s were pulled from secondary locations and pushed closer to potential Storm Shadow corridors. Panzer and Tor units were repositioned around high-value targets in Crimea and the occupied south. Every missile launch now triggered a chain reaction: radars spinning up, interceptors firing, EW systems spiking the airwaves. Then came electronic warfare. Russia tried jamming Storm Shadow's GPS updates and spoofing its navigational fixes. They hoped to force the missile off course or degrade targeting. Some adaptations helped. A few strikes were partially blunted, several missiles were intercepted, some targets were shielded long enough for Russia to relocate or disperse assets, but most attempts failed for the same reason. Storm Shadow didn't rely on just one system, it had backup after backup. Navigation, terrain-following radar, infrared terminal guidance. Even when GPS vanished, it kept flying. Even when radars tried to paint it, its low flight profile and stealth coating kept it alive. Russia's air defenses were stretched, not broken, but bent in ways they hadn't been before. Every Storm Shadow launch forced Russia to react with expensive interceptors, high-risk repositioning, and resource drain. And then came the moment Moscow feared most, the moment when British and French engineers simply changed the rules. And just when Russia thought it was catching up, Britain and France changed the rules of the game. For 2 years, Storm Shadow had been a caged weapon, capable of striking deep into Russia, but forbidden from crossing the border. London and Paris insisted on responsible use. Ukraine insisted on survival. That tension finally snapped in 2025. By mid-2024, Russia's escalation pattern was unmistakable. Energy grid attacks, glide bomb saturation, Shahed barrages, and long-range missiles hitting cities far from the front. Britain and France stopped pretending that restraint was working. Officials in London began arguing privately that Ukraine was fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Paris echoed the same point. Deterrence without the ability to strike back is fantasy, and so came the quiet shift. No dramatic announcement, no televised speech, just a calibrated, deliberate leak through NATO channels. Ukraine was now permitted to use Storm Shadow and Scalp on military targets inside Russia. A line that had defined the war simply vanished overnight. This wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Russia kept striking Ukraine from safe zones across the border. Ukrainian cities were taking damage with no ability to retaliate. Russian air bases and logistics hubs just inside Russia were untouchable. Until now. London and Paris concluded the same thing. Deterrence only works if the aggressor feels pain. And Ukraine didn't waste time. In summer 2025, storm shadows began skimming low across the border at dawn and dusk. Targets were chosen with surgical precision. Depots, command centers, SAM batteries, logistics nodes. But the world only paid attention when one strike shattered Russia's sense of internal safety. A storm shadow hit a chemical production complex Russia had been using for military supply chains, a facility previously considered out of reach. The missile bypassed reinforced air defenses. It flew under radar arcs designed for aircraft, not terrain-hugging cruise weapons. It detached its BROACH warhead exactly as intended. For the first time in the entire war, Russian civilians witnessed what Ukrainians had lived with for years, a precision strike deep inside their territory, on infrastructure feeding the war machine. Suddenly, governors demanded SAM sites for their own cities. Factories pushed for evacuation plans. Internal security units scrambled to protect assets that had never been threatened before. Russia's leadership understood the implication. Storm Shadow erased the illusion of safety. Internal defense resources were stretched thin. Valuable interceptors had to be moved away from the front. Rear area complacency evaporated. And yet, for all this growing power, one limitation remained, and it wasn't Russian. Storm Shadow became the weapon that terrified Russia, but it was also the weapon Ukraine could never afford to waste. For all its power, there was a brutal, unavoidable truth. Ukraine never had enough of them. London had supplied Ukraine with an estimated 100 to 200 missiles, a number impressive for headlines, but painfully small in a war where Russia launched thousands of guided bombs and cruise missiles every month. Storm Shadow wasn't designed for mass volume warfare. It was a precision scalpel, expensive, complex, and held in limited reserve even by NATO standards. Each strike came with a strategic calculation. Is this target worth one of the few remaining missiles capable of changing the front? Paris added its Scalp versions, but the numbers were even tighter. France had built fewer units, used many in the Middle East, and kept a strict reserve for its own deterrence posture. Ukraine quickly realized the harsh arithmetic. Storm Shadow was the best missile it had, and the scarcest. Each Storm Shadow runs into millions per unit, not only in manufacturing but in composite stealth materials. BROACH two-stage penetrating warhead. Inertial plus terrain matching plus GPS plus infrared terminal guidance. Low altitude, terrain following flight systems. Rebuilding these components would require expanding factories and restarting industrial processes dormant for years. Europe wasn't ready for that scale in 2023. It still isn't fully ready in 2025. The companies behind the missile, MBDA UK and MBDA France, cannot simply flip a switch and produce dozens per month. They need rare electronics, specialized jet engines, classified warhead components, long supply chains spanning multiple NATO countries. Even with political urgency, production ramping takes years, not months. Commanders began talking about Storm Shadow in the same way snipers talk about their final rounds. Save it for a target that matters. Save it for a moment that changes the war. And Storm Shadow was never wasted. No symbolic targets, no political theater, no strikes that merely look good. Every launch was operational or strategic. a depot, a fleet asset, a command center, a bridge, an air defense node. This scarcity created a new strategic mindset. A great weapon can change the war, but only if you can afford to fire it. And that scarcity pushed Ukraine toward an uncomfortable realization. The West can open the door, but Ukraine must step through it alone. Storm Shadow didn't just give Ukraine a long arm, it gave Ukraine a template, a vision of what modern deep strike warfare actually looks like. And once Ukraine saw what was possible, it refused to go back. Storm Shadow became more than a missile. It became a blueprint, a teacher, and ultimately a catalyst for Ukraine's own long-range revolution. Before the war, Ukraine's HRIM 2 ballistic missile project was underfunded, politically fragile, and moving at a snail's pace. Now Ukraine suddenly had a working model of long-range penetration, multi-layered guidance, stealth optimization, hardened target destruction. HRIM 2 was rapidly accelerated, redesigned, and militarized. Engineers now had real battlefield data showing what Russian air defenses see and what they miss, how low-altitude profiles confuse S-300 and S-400 radar loops, how to fuse guidance systems so jamming becomes irrelevant. Storm Shadow didn't replace HRIM 2, it sharpened it. When Ukraine first fired its Indigenous Maros long-range cruise missile, outside analysts immediately noticed something. It behaved like a Storm Shadow, not identical, but unmistakably inspired. Maras incorporated low-altitude, terrain-hugging flight, reduced radar signature design, multi-mode terminal seeker logic, modular warheads for deep penetration strikes. Storm Shadow taught Ukraine the art of deep strike. Maras ensured Ukraine could continue the campaign even when Western stockpiles ran dry. Before Storm Shadow, the logic of Ukraine's war was defensive. Stop Russian advances, hold cities, survive waves of missiles. Storm Shadow shattered that mindset. Suddenly, Ukraine was studying. Factory complexes 300 kilometers behind Russian lines, naval bases in occupied Crimea, command nodes inside Russia itself, rail choke points and oil depots deep in Russian territory. Storm Shadow showed Ukraine a simple, brutal truth. You don't win a war by only defending. You win by making the enemy bleed where he thinks he is safe. That became the philosophical foundation for Ukraine's Indigenous missile renaissance. Not a war winner, not a footnote. A weapon that expanded Ukraine's reach, shattered Russia's assumptions, and forced a continental military power to re-engineer an entire front. Storm Shadow didn't decide the fate of the war. It changed the shape of the war. And sometimes changing the shape is the very thing that decides everything. So now the question is this: if one British missile could reshape the battlefield this much, what happens when Ukraine builds an arsenal of its own? If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into geopolitics. We would love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know what you think. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.